Freedom Knows No Color, Chapter 10. Suddenly, Julian heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Dina approaching. "Julian," she panted when she reached him, "there's a little shack down by the river. It's in a clump of sycamore trees. Go there and wait for word from me. It's not safe for you to stay here." "But Dina, what happened?" Julian asked. "What happened to Mr. Marston?" Dina's eyes were wide with terror. "Just go to the shack, Julian. Hurry! I'm sending Daniel, too. Feelings will be running high when they find out Mr. Marston has been murdered." "Murdered?" Julian cried. He grabbed Dina by the shoulders. "Dina, do you know what happened?" He asked one more time. He looked into her eyes. He had the feeling that she knew more than she was telling him. Dina put her hands on Julian's chest and gave him a push. "Just go!" she sobbed. "I'll bring word of what's happening as soon as I can." Julian hurried down the road to the little shack Dina had described. It was shrouded in a great clump of trees and shrubbery. He entered the empty shack and threw himself in a corner. He looked around. The shack was reminiscent of other shacks he had hidden in during his escape from the cannon plantation. Julian put his head on his knees and tried to block out the fears that rose within him, but it was no use. Suddenly, in his mind, Julian was running through swamps and woodlands. He was being chased by baying dogs. He was facing the barrel of a rifle, looking into eyes filled with hatred and greed. "I'm running again," he thought despairingly. "Just like before. I'm running, and the white men are after me." How far would he have to run this time, he wondered, and how could he ever be free again? There were states like Illinois where a black man could go to escape slavery, but there were no states where he could go to escape a murder charge. No matter where he went, he would be a wanted man. In less than an hour, Daniel showed up, his eyes wide with fear. "Julian, the sheriff was just at the boarding house looking for you. I heard him tell Mrs. Layton that old Hank said you killed Mr. Marston for his gold watch. Dina told me to come here, too. She said no black man is safe in Cairo tonight." Julian's mind was spinning with fear. He had lived long enough to know that Dina was telling the truth. The townspeople would look for a scapegoat to blame for the murder of a respected old man. If they didn't catch Julian, they'd blame someone else, and more than likely, that person would be black. "I say we run for it," Daniel said. "Let's not wait around for them to find us." "No," Julian said, shaking his head. "But they'll lynch us, Julian," Daniel said. "Dina said she'd come," Julian replied. "We have to wait for her. She'll bring news of what's happening." Near midnight, something rustled outside the shack. Julian sprang to his feet. He took out the pocket knife he still carried. It wasn't much, he knew, but it was all he had. "They're coming!" Daniel cried. "They're coming to lynch us!" Julian peered through a crack by the door. It was Dina. "Let me in," she whispered. Once inside, she handed Julian a small sack of money. "This will be enough to get you to New England," she said. "If you go quickly, you can—" Julian reached out and grasped Dina's shoulders firmly. He looked into her beautiful dark eyes. "Dina, you know something, don't you?" he asked. Dina shook her head. "Tell me, Dina, please!" Julian pleaded. Dina began to sob then, her shoulders heaving up and down. Julian drew her close and held her against his chest. "Shh," he said. "It's all right. Just tell us what you saw." He said he'd run my mother out of business if I said anything," Dina cried in a hoarse whisper. "He said he had ways of closing the boarding house down and throwing her out on the streets." "Who said that?" Julian demanded. Percy Marston," Dina whispered. "Percy Marston?" Julian said. "Mr. Marston's son?" Dina nodded and took a deep breath. Then she continued. "He was fighting with Mr. Marston over money again. Percy wanted his father to give him a bigger allowance. When Mr. Marston refused, he told Mr. Marston that he was being frivolous with Percy's inheritance." "Go on," Julian said. "I was upstairs in Mrs. Marston's bedroom. Percy didn't know I was there because I usually don't work that late. Suddenly, I heard Mr. Marston cry out. I went downstairs and found Percy kneeling over his father, taking the watch out of his pocket. And Mr. Marston was dead." "Dina, are you saying Percy Marston killed his father?" Julian asked. "Yes, and he made it look like a robber did it," Dina said, wiping her eyes with her apron that she wore. "Dina, you have to tell the sheriff what you saw," Julian said. Dina shook her head. "I can't. Percy said he'd ruin my mother. She worked so hard to get that boarding house, Julian. It's her whole life. I can't let him take it away from her." Daniel spoke up now. "Dina, even if you keep quiet, sooner or later Percy Marston is going to see you as being a danger to him," he said. You won't be safe. Not you or your mother. He's just trying to buy some time until he can figure out what to do." "He's right, Dina," Julian concurred. "Julian, even if I did go to the sheriff, he wouldn't believe me," Dina said. "It would be my word against a white man's." Julian thought a moment. Dina was right. Without some kind of proof, the sheriff probably wouldn't believe her. "Dina, where do you think the gold watch is now?" he asked. Dina thought for a moment and said, "I think Percy still has it. He's the greediest man I know. I think he'll keep the watch and take it north with him on one of his trips. Then he'll sell it." "Do you think the watch is somewhere in the Marston house?" Julian asked. Dina nodded. "I think so," she said. "It's probably in Percy's bedroom." Julian took the girl gently in his arms. "Dina, go to Sheriff Plummer and tell him what you saw. Tell him you have proof that what you say is true. Then take him to the Marston house and together look for the watch." "I can't," Dina cried. "He's the law. He'll never believe me. He'll say I'm covering up for you or for Daniel." "Dina, you have to try," Julian said. "If it doesn't work, we'll run. Maybe we can make it to Canada before they catch us. But if it works, Dina, you'll have done a great thing for me and for Daniel and for all black people." "Oh, Julian, Dina was about to repeat that she couldn't do it, but then she whispered, "I'll try." She pulled her shawl tightly around her shoulders and started for the door. Then she paused and turned. "If I'm not back by dawn, take the money I gave you and run, because you'll know I've failed." Julian and Daniel passed a restless night. Julian drifted in and out of dreams. In one dream, slave catchers were chasing them. In the next, a lynch mob was coming after them. He finally woke just before dawn to the sound of wagon wheels approaching. "Who is it?" Daniel whispered. Julian peered through the crack by the door. "Sheriff Plummer, and he has Dina with him." Julian didn't know what that meant. Did the sheriff force Dina to lead him to them? Or had she convinced him of their innocence and he had brought her here to give them the good news? He took the knife out of his pocket. In the growing light of dawn, Julian and Daniel watched as the sheriff jumped off the wagon. He helped Dina down, and then he turned towards the shack, holding something in his right hand. It was not light enough yet for Julian to make out what it was. "Come on out of there, boys," the sheriff called. Julian tightened his grip on the knife. Neither of them said a word. "I say come out of there now," the sheriff repeated. "Look at what I got here. That little cutthroat Percy Marston hid it in a slit in his feather mattress." Julian squinted his eyes and looked hard through the crack. Dangling from the sheriff's hand was a gold watch, Mr. Marston's watch. Suddenly, Dina was at the door. Julian opened it wide and she flew into his arms. "It's over and you're safe," she cried. "We found the watch and Percy admitted to killing his father. The sheriff has him in jail." "Hallelujah!" Daniel cried, throwing his hat in the air. Julian fairly danced Dina to the wagon. He was so happy that the freedom he had worked so hard to have had not been taken away, and he realized that again he owed his good fortune to Dina. He decided right then and there that she'd be the girl he would marry. In a church, of course. Percy Marston was sent to prison for the murder of his father. His mother died soon after, and the Marston place was sold. Out of a job, Daniel went to work for Mr. Last, whose business by then was flourishing. Julian and Dina were married in the spring of 1859. A year later, the Civil War began, the war that would end slavery across the country. Julian and Daniel joined the Union Army and served in the 54th Massachusetts Colored Infantry. This unit drew black volunteers from all over the United States. 2 of Frederick Douglass's sons served in the same unit. Daniel died in 1863 during an assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. 40% of the 54th died that day, but Julian survived the war. He returned to Cairo and took up wagon making again. He and Dina became the parents of 2 sons and 3 daughters, all born as free Americans who never knew the fear of losing their freedom.